the smell of grass and leather. There were days when we'd play too. We'd cross the lines when the sun would shine and make our dreams come true. I had a glove on my hand and a girl in the stands. She stole my heart like a hit and run. It seems the world was so much simpler back then. We was just out there for fun. I pray for someone to hold your hand and baseball in the summer. Someone to walk with you when this world grows cold. Baseball in the summer. Baseball in the summer.
Welcome to the Brock v. Mac Legendary Podcast, and I am super thrilled today. We're doing a Mac cast with the coach, Don Graves. Don, how are you, given that there's I think a 2-hour time difference, and you're just living it up on that East Coast? 1 hour?
Yeah, 1 hour. I'm an hour ahead of you. People down here, we're always ahead. It's just the way it is.
I knew that was coming. Are you spending your life doing kitchen parties and having fun out there?
I've almost mastered playing the fiddle, and I just hope to go around and with a tin cup and make a few bucks every once in a while.
Amazing. It's been 30 years for some of us, maybe a little less so for some of the McMaster players. But why don't you tell everybody what you're up to these days and, how life has evolved for you?
Well, my wife and I made a decision 10 years ago, actually, to leave Hamilton and to move down to the East Coast. Both my kids, my son Ryan and my daughter Erin, had gone to St. Mary's University in Halifax, and during the course of their undergraduate years, they met people, and those relationships turned into marriage. And so my son met a girl from Truro who went to Dal, and my daughter met a fellow from Bridgewater who went to Dal as well. So they got married, decided they were staying. They loved the East Coast, wanted to stay here. And my wife and I looked at each other and said, why the hell are we staying in Hamilton? So, I'll be honest with you, taking advantage of the housing market was certainly in our interests. So we moved, and we moved about an hour south of Halifax in an area called the South Shore, just between Bridgewater and the ocean, right on the LaHave River. Basically, we're able to get a bit of a dream home with some property and look out on the river. And, it was just time for a change. Both my parents were gone. My sister was in good shape back in Hamilton. So, I like the idea of a different environment. And it was great to get out of the city, to be honest with you.
Yeah, are the people as friendly as one can imagine out there?
Yeah, the people are extremely friendly. They're not always welcoming. When it's one thing to be a tourist, it's another thing to move into a community. So there are some differences around that, which is not unique to Nova Scotia. I think that's the same anywhere. Anytime you move from one community to another, getting involved in that community requires some baby steps and some patience and that sort of thing. And when I got down here, I couldn't get an opportunity to coach baseball to save my life. It was just the way it is. So I had always had a passion for football as well. Even when I was at Mac, I did some work with the football program. So I got into coaching minor football down here, ended up coaching the provincial team, and for a number of years did a bit of work with St. Mary's and St. Avex football program organizations, and just yeah, just kind of followed that for about 4 or 5 years, and then I guess a few years back I sort of had enough of everything and just decided to be around the house a little more.
Yeah,
Plus,
well,
plus your grandkids coming into the pictures changes everything.
yeah. Well, we'll talk a little bit about the
Yeah.
East Coast love of all-star baseballs for whatever reason.
Oh, I
Um,
got a classic story to tell you. I got to
okay.
tell you this one. You mentioned all-star baseballs, and everyone remembers the CIBA and our everybody's friend Bill Martin.
Oh yeah.
Well, my neighbor down in front of me, one day I'm sitting, he's a retired RCMP guy. Him and I are sitting having a beer by the fire, and he's telling me a bit about his life, and his wife, who he married, was her second marriage, blah, blah, blah. She was Bill Martin's first wife.
Oh my goodness. Would
Like,
I have paid to be a fly on that wall right
I
there?
literally fell out of my chair. Like, I was like, what? Oh, she told me all about the All-Star baseball fiasco, and oh my God, it was
Yeah, it's
she lived with it when he lived in Paris, Ontario, and quite. Oh, I don't want to get into the stories. I don't want to be liable for anything, but believe me, they were eye openers, and none of it surprised me because that was one of the reasons I worked so closely with Ward Dills of the OUA to get baseball recognized by the OUA. So I'd hoped it would come under better scrutiny. So,
yeah, I could probably do a this whole podcast series on my own, but I've said it on previous ones. We had a national sponsorship with Rawlings Baseball.
yeah,
Okay, they gave us, I think, 4 dozen balls to give to every team in the country, and we shipped them out to the East Coast, and they got shipped back to us. They said we're not using these; they're not good enough. We use all-star baseballs in the East Coast, and I said, these are major league model Rawlings baseballs that were given to us as part of a national contract.
right.
You will take these and you will use them. I don't think they ever were used, and I could never understand the fascination with it until we started dealing with Bill, and there was
Yeah,
another guy from
yeah,
Truro
yeah,
that was a little bit Wolfville, Nova
yeah,
Scotia. That was they were really difficult to deal with, and probably had their own version of what SIBA looked like. But I'm glad that OUA baseball came, and we'll get into that story because
yeah,
I think
yeah,
it's a real landmark for me,
yeah.
for the sport. Don,
Just,
why don't you tell
just,
us?
just to give you one last point on Bill, he now lives down here over near Wolfville. Went online and got his minister's some kind of minister's certificate and bought a church.
Sorry.
So I don't think I need to say anything else.
No, and neither do I. I just I have nothing to say.
Yeah,
And hopefully that's a new leaf for him. Uh, so hard for me to recover from that. That's kind
yeah,
of
yeah,
a beautiful place for that to end up.
yeah,
Don, why don't you
yeah.
tell us a little bit about how you start, where you grew up, and maybe a
Sure,
little bit of your journey into sports and life before there was a McMaster.
sure. Well, I grew up on the East Mountain area of Hamilton, up in and around an area known as Huntington Park. And I guess from the age of 8 or 9, started playing baseball in what was then back in the 60s, the Hamilton Police Minor Leagues, which was a very well run and highly respected organization. And played up into what is now junior intercounty. They used to have the Hamilton Cubs was a team, and I was I I think I was fairly successful back in those days. There was a number of scouts in the Hamilton area. One Jim Frail for the Pittsburgh Pirates, and uh, another fella for down in Mahoney Park for the Yankees. And in those days, you signed what was called like an A card. If you got signed, it really didn't mean anything else other than if you turned out to be good. You were the property of a particular organization. And so I did that with Frail and the Pirates. Never went anywhere really, but you kind of like the thought of being able to do that at that time. And so anyways, I ended up, like a lot of guys, went as far as I could playing baseball until there was really nowhere else to go, and then flipped over to the fastball, which was very popular in Hamilton as well. Played fastball right up into the late 80s, and then at that time vintage baseball sort of made a comeback, or old timers. So I went back and played that for a number of years, with on the mountain as well. And I think my last year was 94 or 5. Played in the national championships, the vintage championships. So I had a good run, and during that period, I would walk across the street when I was still a student at Mac, and started coaching in the same park that I grew up playing in, with Cherub, and got a little more into it as I was finishing my undergrad, and took over, had the Pee Wee team in Pee Wee and Bantam programs out of Huntington Park or East Mountain. And we had a lot of success. We won an Ontario championship, won a couple of city titles, and so I kind of cut my teeth coaching early with guys who had coached me as a kid. So for me, that was a great honor. Guys like Bill Wheat and Kim Smith, and those individuals who were very influential on my upbringing, to be honest with you. And all of a sudden, one day I saw an ad in the paper. McMaster was looking for a baseball coach. I thought, well, what the hell? I'd like to coach at that level, see what it's all about. And that's where the infamous interview I don't know if it was Bill's resident room or somewhere in Brandon Hall. And excuse me. So I went to that interview, and it was quite funny, to be honest with you. It was, like you said earlier, questions that coming from 20-year-olds, questions that I had sort of had the answers to when I was 16, but you play along, right? You talk a bit about where you come from, what type of coach you think you are, without really saying, well, the type of coach I'm going to be is all dependent on the type of players you are, so you don't want to dump that on them too early on, because it creates an uncertainty that they might be uncomfortable with. So anyways, it worked out, and sadly, Jason Gwynedd had passed away the year before in the car accident. So I was kind of coming into a new program. I think it was a bit directionless, when you've got a bunch of players trying to figure out where they want to go collectively, you get a lot of ideas, but few decisions. It kind of happens. And so they needed some leadership. And the first couple of years was about trying to find out, for me, it was trying to find out what they were all about. What, outside of their baseball talent, what was their character? Who were these guys? How well and how good could their leadership be? What was their capabilities? So that made up a lot of the first couple of years. It wasn't so much a focus on the field, because everybody wants to win, but the league itself was pretty young and pretty raw at that time. So I knew we weren't going to get blown out. We could compete, but I wanted to see beyond that, what the character of that team could be. And so that takes a bit more and time to do that. And it's much more of it's a private, you have to keep a lot of things to yourself when you're doing that, till you get to that point where you can help them with some self-realization about who they are, and you're not having to preach or tell them who they are. So that takes a bit of time, and that was the first couple of years for sure.
Well, I'm surprised you survived the interviewing process, probably because you were sitting in a pool of beer at the time. Knowing,
Well, you know what, I was never one to shy away from a beer myself, so I think that might have been part of the winning the moment.
So Don, tell me a little bit about, you know, it's a bit of a process as an ad in a paper.
Yeah.
How does that lead to Henry being part of your coaching staff? Because didn't he answer the same ad? Is that how that came, or did
He
you guys
did.
know each other?
He actually did. I didn't know that at the time. But I had also known Henry for a long time through Hamilton baseball circles. You know, Henry was an outstanding catcher at the in the inter-county league back in the the late 50s, early 60s. He had a reputation. He was a hard-nosed, take no prisoners kind of player. And he actually scouted for a number of years for the Dodgers. And so, I mean, you don't get those opportunities unless you know the game. And but Henry just has a personality that is as quirky as they come. And when you read stories about throwback athletes and teams and characters on those teams, Henry fits right into that mold. And he brought that. I felt so when I had heard he interviewed, I called him right away and I said, Hank, look, I don't know who they're going to hire, but either way, if it's me, I'd like you to be my bench coach. And if it's you, maybe you could think of a spot for me if that'd be helpful. And it turned out, he was fine. Henry actually was happier to be the bench coach than be the head coach. And he was good at it. He was very good at it. And he just provided some humorous moments that those guys will remember all their lives, I'm sure. I remember one time driving up to Burnie Arbor where we played a lot of our games, and I only lived like 5 minutes from the stadium. So I'm driving in and I look and I see this person hanging on the outfield fence, like 10 feet off the ground, just hanging there on the fence. And it's Henry. And so I get in there and he used to have this blue, it was kind of a see-through thing, but it was a mesh tank top that he would wear to warm up. And he had this little blue aluminum bat that was all dinted to rat shit. And that's what he would hit in the infield with. And because the ball never came off the bat, true. And it made it harder for the infielders. But anyways, he's hanging on this fence, and I walk into the stand and I yell, "Hey, Hank, what the hell are you doing?" "I'm just stretching out, hanging on a fence. These are the kind of things that he would do. And he was a funny guy. I'm kind of jumping around a bit if that's okay, because memories come to play. He had a thing. I think his beef with Fletcher was that he was a lot like Fletcher when he was young.
God save the world from that.
That's what it's. Fletcher was always yapping about something, and he had that mouth. Henry was the same. So
the two of them I hear just went back and forth at each other.
Oh, constantly. And there were some funny lines. There were some, which was really good. But Henry was he was quite a character, and he brought a lot more to the team than a lot of people realize.
Yeah, I did want to touch that. He does some wild things, and hanging around like a bat is just a really good T-shirt waiting to happen. But I think people underestimate sometimes you need a very complimentary coach to take the edge off, especially of kids that are away from home for the first time, or
Yeah.
are getting used to that. They've got academics that are piling on. I think it's good to have kind of a mix of characters. And let me ask you this, to take it back a bit, Don. You went to McMaster as a university. What did you take when you were there?
I went to Mac. I did my undergraduate there. I have a degree in political science, very useful degree, and but it was very helpful for me in terms of understanding different personality types and people, and how to deal with them, and how to deal with groups. And it was. I found that the whole varsity baseball environment was very political. Like you really have to know your opponent, and I'm talking within the university, because there's always those in the field of academics that don't feel that athletics has a place, and you have to constantly be aware and be prepared to counter any arguments that come your way. So yeah, I did my undergraduate there. When I left, I joined the police department in Hamilton. I spent a number of years on the police department before going into the private sector, private insurance investigations. And then in 2000, I started my own business, which I had for about 12 years before I sold it. So, yeah, I was always kind of in that people environment, and that politics was, whether it's politics of business or politics of sport, I was always involved in that.
Well, one thing they had thankfully done away with by the time you arrived on the scene, coaching, was they didn't have to wear the blue uniforms anymore. I don't think. I think I remember you guys in maroon and gray, at least.
Yeah,
but
it was pretty bad. So again, what I had to do is, I had a good buddy, Brian Mason, who sadly just passed away, who owned a excuse me, who owned a sport clothing business in Dundas, and he designed new uniforms for us. Got a deal with Saxon out of Brantford, and you little things like that are extremely important. The importance of, you need to have good uniforms. I wanted home and away, so I had to go and make these arguments to the department for funding. And you would think that the concept of looking good and playing good would not be that far-fetched to a lot of people. And Therese Quigley, in her defense, got that 100%. And at the time, McMaster was completely changing its look on the field, on the court and on the field. So we were kind of at the right time for that sort of thing. And Brian was able to get me a really good quality uniform, but at terrific price in the way, pitching it to the department allowed. We fortunately got rid of the blue.
Yeah, well, the blue ones are going to be collector items at some point.
Yeah. I could never understand it, but nevertheless.
Well, you just, at that point, U of T was on the scene. U of T eventually emerged from the shadows and had a darn good squad. And, kind of reminding me a little bit of Henry was Rick Johnston, who was the coach over at U of T.
Yeah.
Good guy, but, I think his reputation is pretty well known, that he would hit pop flies to himself. Like, that was how hardcore he was, right? So,
yeah. Henry would work our catchers. He just had so many old school drills that, Mike Grilly and Billy and Sean Bush later on. The drills that Henry put these guys through with the tennis rackets and tennis balls and all kinds of things, he would just grind those guys. And oddly enough, I think that by the year 2000, Hank and I could see a distinct change in the character and mental toughness of students coming into school. After 2000, the unfortunate influx of helicopter parents and unrealistic expectations was starting to proliferate, and that became a problem. And I would think, like, I had a player's mother phone me and ask why he wasn't playing. A mother. And I was like, your son is 18 years old. If he has a problem, you tell him to come and see me. But that just really signified a huge change. A
Yeah.
lot of kids coming out of these, and I don't want to throw a blanket over everything, but a lot of these rep programs were poorly coached. There was a proliferation of rep programs, AAA, AA, all of this kind of stuff. There weren't enough good coaches around, and subsequently, that they focused on a lot of the wrong things, and building character kind of fell by the wayside. And it started to show in the kids that were coming into the program, and that kind of wears on you. And I think for me, the first year in 2002, I was asked to coach the first Canadian university team to go to the World Championships in Sicily, and I was like honored to do that. And then I found out there was no funding. So I remember going to Sheila Copps, who was from Hamilton, and saying, Sheila, look, this is ridiculous. We're going on the world stage and we have no funding. We can't take the best team that we can field by any stretch of the imagination. We don't even have uniforms. And she said, oh, Don, don't worry about it. I'm going to get you $50,000 and blah, 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 blah. Of course, never happened. Surprise, surprise. We get these old Team Canada uniforms that come through, which we appreciated, but nevertheless. And then I had to get players and convince them that they had to pay their own way to go. Well, you're not going to get the best players by any stretch. There were a lot of Canadian kids at that time going to schools in the U.S. I can think of Delfino and a few others. Well, they weren't going to pay their own way to go over to Sicily. Like, it wasn't going to happen. I couldn't even get coaches to go. So I didn't walk away from it because I had said I would do it. But when I came back from that, I said to my wife, I'm done with coaching. I'm done with having to fight this thing on two fronts. It's just not right. It's not fair to the players. And quite frankly, I was getting to the point where I didn't want to go to practice. And when that happens, it's time to walk away. And that was, so there was a sort of a real, sort of a real build-up of things over a couple of years that sort of led to that decision. And I had thought that I left the program in good hands, but I didn't. And the scouting network that I had put together with graduate players who had become teachers across the province and was never utilized by those that, even to this day, nothing. So you know what? I mean, the program, I think, reflects the lack of organization and the lack of drive and determination. And people won't like me saying that, but I'm sorry. It's the way it is.
Well, there's ebb and flow that goes into everything, but the reality is, I think, by pulling back the curtain on what was going on 30 years ago or 20 years ago now, it helps people understand what the potential of these programs are as opposed to where they are today. And, I think it's important to understand that these people put efforts, and a lot of effort, into building something that was going to be a good counterbalance to going to the United States, which was really hard to do in the 90s. There was not covered by NAFTA at that time. It was really difficult for kids to get stateside, and this was a really viable effort for some really great people to continue their playing careers and to shine on a stage. And that gives us a really good chance to take a little U-turn back here, because I really, we're going to examine more points of what you've talked about with having to fight the admin at the school and some of these types of things. But I would say the prototypical Canadian player that I've ever seen in my lifetime is obviously Brad Reason, who you had the pleasure of coaching.
Yeah.
I say probably pleasure because he's easy to coach, I think, from any number of points. But tell me a little bit what it was like coaching Brad.
Well, Brad was, when Brad walked, when I first met Brad, I looked at this kid. Okay, skinny kid, there was nothing physical about him that was overly impressive. He wasn't 6'4", 220 or anything like that. But he was, when you talk to Brad, he was very thoughtful. Like the answers that he would give you were well thought out. And then when I saw him, he first came out, he had these work gloves on,
Yeah.
not baseball gloves. They were like leather work gloves. And I'm looking and I'm thinking, okay, well, I don't think I've ever seen a quicker pair of hands on a ball player. Like Scott Hughes had a tremendously fast swing. His bat speed was very high, but Reese could hit the ball when it was almost past the plate. His hands were so quick. And he was, I never knew that until after he was finished playing, that he had played first base for Team Ontario. I never had him at first base at all. To me, he came out, we had him in the middle of the infield. He was just, he just didn't, he had no ego whatsoever. He was not going to say, well, second base, I played first base for Team Ontario. Why am I not? There was none of that with Brad. Brad went where he was told to go, and he did the best job he could when he got there. And I cannot remember, I don't remember any games where he made any mental errors that cost us anything. He was just an outstanding ball player and a great guy.
Yeah, I think people don't understand how much work went into that. Like Roger Reason, Brad's dad, would throw batting practice to him every night. And,
I remember in the Nationals in '97, Brad hit one on the roof of I think it was the rink or on the over center field. I think there was a rink out there or some building. And the next thing, it was a great shot, blah, blah, blah. And I had out of the corner of my eye, I see this guy climbing a fence onto the roof, and it was Roger to get the ball that Brad hit, right? Which, not many fathers would be doing that. So it was pretty good.
Roger, pretty
In
devoted.
fact, I gave the original banner we had, I rolled it up. When I was living here, put it in a tube, and a buddy of mine who was visiting from Hamilton took it back with him and dropped it off at Roger's house on the way back. And Roger told me that it would go up in the cottage where Brad loved to spend time. So I imagine it's still there.
I have seen it. And
so there you go.
Much to the disgust of a Brock guy, but for years we kind of, Brad was, he worked his way into that hand-eye coordination. And I tell this story, I don't think I've told it on a podcast, but for years afterwards, Brad retired early from baseball. He retired around 25, 26, and just became more involved with swimming and running, and would do
Right.
these triathlons and stuff. But he and I would play squash on Sundays, and you know, I'm quite a bit bigger than Brad. So like I'm at that point I'm 6'3" and probably 215, 220 pounds. And I'm fairly strong, let's put it that way. But I could not, and I could power Brad all over the court.
Yeah.
But I could never beat him. Never.
Yeah.
He just would do a drop shot, or he would be quick. He was deceptively quick. He couldn't run very fast in a straight line, but he was very quick.
Yeah.
And just a wonderful guy that is, in a team environment, he would just have that little twinkle in his eye, and you knew that it didn't matter who was pitching, that the next one was going into a gap.
Yeah.
And I haven't seen anyone that had a twinkle in their eye like Brad did when he knew he was going to go up and get a hit. And then he would kind of shucks it all the time. But
yeah,
just a great hitter.
Yeah, he was a great situational hitter. And that's why I get back to about the quick hands. He was able to go the other way when he had to pull the ball. He didn't have a long loopy swing. It was nice and tight and quick, and he just had great hand-eye. I mean, he was gifted, no doubt about it.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about some of the players that would have been impactful in your coaching career, Don. I know that, we touched on Brad, obviously, because, he's passed from colon cancer, and we want to do something to have people remember what a great person he was in life. But there are other great players, Craig Cooper and a few others that have been brought up. Do you have some reflections on particularly the build up to the national championship and some of the people that were difference makers in terms of people? And then we can touch on Newton, but that it will usually involve cursing of some sort or another. But just some of the people that were difference makers in those early years of the Mac program.
Well, clearly, we always talk about Scotty Hughes and Reeson and Cooper and Pino and those guys. They're the obvious ones to talk about because they are, for the most part, head and shoulders above. Excuse me. Scott Ralph was a very much an underrated player. I in all my years coaching, I've never seen anyone as good at fielding a ball in shortstop as Scott Ralph was. I mean, he was just, he came out, when he tried out, it was the last day of tryouts. We basically decided on the team, and he came out and asked if he could try out. And I looked at Henry and I said, okay, well, where do you play? And he said, shortstop. And I said, where have you played? And he goes, Burlington. And Burlington players always there's a bit of a thing with them. And anyways, I said to Henry, well, put him through some drills. And he went out there and my jaw dropped. I mean, he did not miss a ball. He charged the ball, great body control. It didn't take you long to realize he was a blue chip, this kid. So he brought a lot to our team because it basically allowed us to solidify the infield and move guys like Lunny and Pino and Taylor and Hughes and move them into places where we would get the maximum benefit from them depending on who we were playing and what we needed. But aside from those guys, the team was really all about a lot of other guys too. Jeff Aikett was maybe one of the best utility players I've ever had. He could play the infield, the outfield. He could run like the wind. He was always ready to go. If I wanted him to pinch run, he was out there and he was into it. We had another guy who came out, Dexter Brozo, who was just an outstanding hitter and infielder. Brad Arms was a guy, a middle reliever who in 97 was the glue of our pitching staff because he could always be relied on for the, seventh, eighth inning so that we could get to Pino to close. And he was not overpowering. He would throw all kinds of junk. He must have had 5 pitches. Whether they all worked or not, he believed they did. And that's what counted, right? He had
Yep.
he had a great amount of confidence in himself. So he wanted to get in there all the time. There's a lot of guys who will, when it's tough going and they've got to go in, they kind of shrink back a bit. They're not really, Brad would come down and say, I'm ready to go. I'm ready to go. And he'd tell me he was ready, So he was a huge part of our success. And I have to honestly say that from top to Mike Grilly, who out of Stony Creek, there's a guy who came along. Not many people knew much about him. As a catcher, he was terrific. He had a rocket of an arm. He could hit, he could run. And even in his last year, he pitched for us. Like, these are the kind of guys that you just don't get a lot. And they want to play, they want to contribute, they'll do anything to contribute. They never sulk about not playing, and they just make your life as a coach so much easier. And that's what I was talking earlier about, developing that character, team character. You have to have those guys. You have to have them. And
Yeah.
we were fortunate in that regard.
Do you know how they were you? So I know in the Brock scenario that a bunch of us recruited people. We helped aided in the recruiting process, but Coach McRae had a whole network, and I sent out hundreds of recruiting letters on his behalf. And Mike would do a lot of personal recruiting, and then I think that carried on for a time. How would kids that were at Mac come to know that you guys were in tryouts? Because I've heard this a lot where I think it was the same with Brett Gibson. Talk to someone in residence and all of a sudden he shows up, and you guys are having to adjust your team on the fly a lot. Was it difficult?
No, I don't. It wasn't difficult. In fact, Cam Dunlop deserves a lot of credit for that because he was at the school and very active and doing some work part-time within the athletic department. So back then, social media wasn't what it is today. And so he would organize a lot of pamphlets, getting them printed, getting them out into residents. We tried to get things put in orientation bags. I had a fairly good connection within the high school system in Ontario. I had coached at Sherwood High School in Hamilton, and we were fortunate enough to get to the Apprentice Cup one year. So, you meet people, you kind of get to know. I would go to a lot of tournaments and try to talk to parents and players one-on-one. It wasn't a mass mailing type of thing. It was more targeted. And because I knew we were only going to be able to bring in, if I could bring in 4 to 5 quality guys each year, they would know someone who would know someone. So you might get a little bit more momentum from that. But aside from that, we had to focus on winning, because winning gets coverage in the Spectator in Hamilton. We had a great supporter in Ken Welsh, who used to do a lot of OUA TV programming. We had a dedicated person in the school newspaper, and she was terrific. She wrote a lot of articles and interviews. So we just kind of did what we could do with it, with the budget we had and the time we had, bearing in mind that, like most Canadian coaches, you're working full time and you got a family to take care of. So there's only so much you can do, quite frankly.
Yeah, there's got to be a great appreciation for how patient and tolerant your wife and kids are during this time,
Oh,
because it's a big
uh,
commitment. Um,
yeah. My my wife was amazing the whole time. I mean, her birthday's in October. Our anniversary was in October. So for 8 to 10 years, I'm tied down with baseball in October, and she was okay with it. And now, mind you, when I finally packed it in, she said, "You got some years to make up for." So which I'm still doing, and and my kids were terrific too. My son was a terrific baseball player himself and hockey player, and still is. My daughter played varsity basketball at St. Mary's, so I had a lot of a great amount of the reason that I didn't get into higher level coaching before I did was because I was busy with them. Excuse me, they're twins. So, you know, we'd be going from the baseball diamond to the basketball court to the rink and that's the way a lot of parents are. That's and you got to put the time in. I always said I would never sacrifice any time with my kids for my own coaching success. So I think I did that. I think if I've asked them about that, if they felt that I cheated them at all, they don't. They were, so that's kind of a good. I'm kind of glad it worked out that way, quite frankly.
yeah, I think it's important too for people to understand that, because so many of the people I've interviewed on these podcasts are coaching currently because they get kids, and I mean, I've been through it. My daughters are 19 and 21 playing scholarship in soccer, and the other one is making her way through Laurier. So you just it's countless the hours that you
Yeah,
put in as a
yeah.
parent. Interesting to it kind of bring us into some other topics that I wanted to kind of tackle with you, Don. You know, one of the things is, with McMaster, they have a football program there, which
Mm,
soaks up a lot of sun, really, at the end of the day.
yeah.
And so, I think there's always a difficulty getting the attention of the athletic department when they've got this huge beast there. And they also had a very successful basketball team. And so was it difficult to get the athletic department paying enough attention? And that could have been driven by personalities. You've mentioned Therese, who was very well regarded as a McMaster athletic director, but there were changes in admin that all the way along. And like, how difficult was it to engage with the athletic department?
Um, that's a bit of a tough question to answer, to be honest with you, because I've recognized that the football program is kind of the king on campus as far as administration is concerned. Particularly when Greg Marshall came, they were paying a lot of money for that program and they wanted results, and they invested a lot of their future in the new stadium. And all of that is good. I'm not saying they should not have done that. It was a smart move. Um, one of the things before the Mac baseball programs, 96, 97 in particular, Mac teams had not done very well for quite some time prior to that. And I've often maintained that our success and the coverage that we got on campus and locally started to change the attitudes about winning and losing at Mac. And winning's a funny thing. I mean, everybody wants to be part of a winner. Everybody agrees with what you say when you're winning. So it is important to do that. And um, after we won in 97, the department was a lot better in terms of providing services for us. So they did a deal with the city that would allow us to play at Bernie Arbor Stadium. They did some deals with bus lines that got us, we didn't have to go on school buses anymore. We had, coaches, which was a big deal. So they were really good in that regard. And I think they recognized, a lot of the players were recognized. Guys like Hughes and Doug Lunny were recognized for their academic achievement as well as their athletic achievement and won awards for it. So there was a lot of support in that regard. Football and basketball, they are what they are. They've been there a long time. Baseball hasn't been around that long. And I don't know, since I left, I don't know what the attitude of the current coaching staff is towards developing that relationship with the school. I don't know. So it's hard for me. But when I was there, it significantly improved from my first year through to my last year. The department was very supportive of what we were doing.
We're going to talk a little bit about the development of OUA baseball here in a minute, but before we do that, we'll talk a little bit about rivalries between the lines, which are always fun.
Yeah.
So you guys, obviously, we're on a podcast called Brock versus Mac, so clearly there was always a very intense rivalry with the Brock team, and I think we all kind of know that. It's because I think at that time the two teams were clearly the two premier programs in Ontario. But you guys also had, it started really auspiciously, a very heated rivalry with the Durham College, because at that time we were playing colleges, but it was more personal with you guys because Sam Dempster, in a exhibition game where you guys only had 8 players, had his leadoff hitter bunt down the third baseline because Mac wasn't fielding a third baseman. And
right.
That just started, we all know what that does to someone like Bill Newton. So that started the tip. But tell me a little bit about, the animosity with Durham College and your dealings with Ken Babcock and Sam Dempster and your feelings on that program.
Listen, Ken Babcock, I have no issue with whatsoever. I had a lot of respect and have a lot of time for Ken. I think that the problem there was with Sam Dempster. He, for some reason, I'd never met Sam before I started coaching. Never met him. When I first got there and went to shake his hand, you introduce yourself. He was just totally dismissive. Now, I had no idea. I didn't know why. Now, I found out as time went on, there were a number of players that he was familiar with that we had, Reeson and Lunny and some of those guys. And I don't know whether he was annoyed that they didn't go there. I really don't know. I can honestly tell you, I never had a civil conversation with Sam the entire time we were involved in playing with him. So I don't know. And I talked to quite frequently and had no problem. Even after years later, I happened to see his name come up on something and kind of just communicated a bit, and he was fine. So I think the issue there was more between Sam being a little bit annoyed with the fact that we had some players he had wanted. That's all. The only thing I can think it was. But when he bunted down third baseline, I basically at that point said, well, I'm not going to give this guy any respect at all. He's clearly not showing us any, so be it. That's the way you want it. That's the way it'll be. And it just went from there. So,
Yeah, I had some exposure, obviously, playing against Sam in high school, and obviously coached. I think part of it also is probably done. When they opened SEBA up, and it had been 4 teams started, but then the next year there are 6 to 8
Right.
teams in Ontario, and then there's 12 teams in Ontario at a certain point. And one of the big differentiating points is the colleges only had in some cases 1 and 2 year programs, so those athletes were in and out quick. And the universities had 4 to 5 year eligibility, even though in Scott's case he parlayed that into a 10-year career somehow.
Lenny was pretty close to him too.
Yeah. Between the two of them, it's
That's
like
right.
you might not want to hold them up as poster children for eligibility. But I think part of it was probably frustration on Sam's part, because Durham went from being the team to struggling to keep up.
Yeah.
And he certainly knows his baseball. The best ever clinic is great, but he's a competitor on the lines for sure. And sometimes I'll admit it, there were times where it rubbed me the wrong way. I was like, I just want to obliterate Durham now. And so I think that's a different kind of a rivalry than U of T or Brock. I mean, U of T was always fun to play because the games were close and it was hard to hit those lefties. And you guys were always great because the games were, again, very competitive, and teams that aren't too far apart from each other. And just, I think one of the things with McMaster is the entrance marks are so high at Mac that you guys were dealing with a smaller pool of potential players at times, right?
Yeah, I had a number of players who I had targeted to come that just couldn't get in. They just didn't have. And then I had a couple. Excuse me, just getting over a cold. Who I kind of went back for them to get them in, and then they just didn't pan out. I kind of went to the wall for do you remember that Clayton Muhammad kid? Was a pitcher, left-handed pitcher, pitched for Brampton Centennial. They won the Apprentice Cup one year. He had a lot of potential, and he came and he played 1 year and just didn't go to class, didn't show up to practice. It was just a total bust. So you sometimes you make a mistake, right? So, but I think in a lot of ways having the rigorous standards, academic standards, was good for us in terms of the quality and character of the players that we had.
I'm going to ask you a coaching question now because it's of interest to me. What's the difference between handling position players and pitchers? That's my own greedy self-interest talking there. But have you found that to be a difficult thing or something you enjoy?
I enjoy it. It's totally different. And you got to remember in Canadian college or university baseball, many pitchers are also position players. When I think of the staff we had, we really only had a few guys that were only pitchers. Gibby. Later on, a kid named Mike Heitinen, maybe. But it was easier to work with pitchers who pitched only than it was with players that did both. When I'm thinking of guys that pitch only, like Gibby's a classic example. Gibby would break down every team he was going to pitch against. He would go through, he knew the players, he knew their tendencies, just like any pitcher does, right? You do that if you're worth your salt. You constantly work on your location. You don't get into the habit of throwing your fastball in the same spot every time. If you you get into a third time through the order, you change your, instead of fastball, breaking ball, you change it up and you start them out with something different. All of that kind of stuff. They knew the importance of, just pitchers know the importance of having more than 2 pitches and changing speeds on a fastball. Whereas guys, it's just different with players who are position players too, because they have to also think about hitting and fielding and not just pitching. So you can't be all things. So something is going to suffer a little bit. And, it's a different ball game. I think I would have loved to have had a pitching coach, someone, but I just couldn't find anyone in our area that had the time or the expertise to do that exclusively. So
yeah, from a personality standpoint, pitchers can be difficult too.
Oh yeah,
they are neurotic, or they are high maintenance, I think is safe to say. I can qualify that from having spent a lot of time around it and studied high performance, because it comes with, it's both sides of that sword. You're either going to really put your team in a bad spot if you have a bad start, and sometimes you can't control that. It could be just that you're feeling off, or you just don't have touch, you didn't warm up properly, whatever. But you also have people always looking over your shoulder, because you know that the bullpen is there. But also, when you go out and you pitch well, you get probably an inappropriate amount of the praise at that point, and you have to be a little bit of a person that likes to chase that. And performance mentality is different than, it's just a different mindset. And I think it's the hardest part of managing pitchers is their personalities a lot of the times, because you're right, they can focus on what it is they need to do, but it's how they react to things that is different.
And it comes down to sometimes simple things like knowing when to visit them on the mound, knowing when to let him work his way through it. Some guys hate it when you come out to the mound. They see it as demeaning, and they don't want that. Other guys, you can go out, and I would go and I'd usually break them up, make some kind of joke to kind of loosen them up. And, so you got to know the individual, right? Whereas a little different with a position player.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit about winning the Nationals finally and slaying that Brock Dragon. We could talk a little bit about that famous series to get to Nationals. So you guys had tasted it already in '96 when the finals were in St. Catharines. But what was it like? You remember that how intense that was, and the walk-off and all of that stuff, I think, is important for the Brock people to understand what that was like being a McMaster Marauder while you're beating down this team that you did hate because they seem like your mortal enemy, from that perspective.
Yeah, it's funny. As time goes on, I don't remember it so much as a hate thing as I do a respect and relief thing. There were two. At the time, you just want to beat the shit out of each other. That's all. I mean, it's that simple, and everything is magnified. But as with the benefit of hindsight and a little more maturity, and I kind of look at it now as it's like the Yankees and the Red Sox. Brock was a little more buttoned down and neat, and the hair was short, and whereas we were not quite that way, because that wasn't a focus for me. If they were performing, I didn't care that they were a little scruffy. It didn't bother me that much. So, and I didn't want to make them into something they weren't. So anyways, but it was just such a great level of competition. It was so back and forth all the time, it was like two heavyweight fighters knocking each other on their ass. And, it ended up in a lot of cases last man standing. It's kind of what it was. And I always Jeff had a good staff. Briggs Jude was a good baseball guy, and I liked Wayne. I thought he was a good guy, and the other guys on the staff, good. They were good too. Jeff wasn't an overly friendly guy. Like him and I would talk, but I think there was a mutual respect there. I had a lot of respect for how well organized the Brock program was. A little, you watch even teams in warm-ups, and coaches will often do that to get some insight into strengths, weaknesses, what guys are doing. There's a lot of the other teams in the league, you didn't even bother watching their warm-up because it was so scattered and all over the place that you weren't going to learn anything. You're just going to waste your time. So I think that our two teams, just the programs were just that much better than others, and they were run by baseball guys who'd been around the game a long time, and so intensity 100%. I mean, it was big, and it was great for when we knocked Brock off and to get to the Nationals. But by the same token, the next year we only lost one game all year and got bumped off by Brock, in '98. So I mean, it's back and forth, right? It always goes back and forth. It's just the nature of the beast. So, and there's an intensity between players. So if you took the guys from '97 Brock and the guys from '97 Mac, there was a rivalry within rivalries. There were guys like Cooper. He was a pretty intense dude, and he wanted to be better than his counterpart, or he wanted to hit better than somebody on Brock, and it's back and forth. As the years went by, some of the teams felt that Brock was the big rival, but there wasn't that rival between players that there was in '97. And that makes for a whole different level of baseball. And that goes back to a different era. You might think '97 to 2000 is a long time, but in baseball lives, it's a long time. There's a whole different culture coming through. And '97, '98, probably the end of that culture of the '90s, I think. And that's why it was so intense.
And there was immense bridges between these programs. So you have Rick Bottomley, who's a Hamilton guy.
Yeah.
You have Jess Dixon, who's a Hamilton person.
I knew Jess's dad, actually.
Yeah.
I knew his father.
We had 7 Burlington guys. To your point,
well, you had Nat too, right?
Yeah, Jeff
Yeah,
Knapp.
well, Napper's uncle and I went to high school together. I knew his dad very well. So there was connections.
Yeah, we had a lot of Hamilton connections, but also to your point about edge and attitude, we did have 7 originating Burlington players, and they did carry themselves differently. And then we had 5 Oshawa guys who all would have been connected to Brad and Doug.
Right.
So, from that perspective, we all either played against each other or with each other. And so there was an awareness. I think, it was less, I think when Brock started getting the players they got a pipeline for a little while out of Windsor. It's different, right? Because you're not seeing those guys in the summer, and you have that turning over of that. You're right. Obviously, it's a crowning achievement to win a Nationals, and you guys got inducted as a team into the McMaster Hall of Fame for achieving that achievement. Is there any ridiculous things that you remember in the lead up to it, that you think, I can't believe that this happened to us, or like, I say it all the time. When Brock won their first national championship, they were given a bus, and then the bus broke down on the way to nationals, and then it broke down on the way back from nationals. That should have probably been an inclination that they needed to work on an airline sponsor. But
Jesus.
we all have some ridiculous stories, and you got any that might be in
Boy.
your private treasure chest of, God, I can't believe that kid did that, or he
Well,
said that.
I think one of the things I would have got in a lot of trouble for today was when we would go on the road, if we went to Guelph or Waterloo or whatever, and if we won, I would get the bus to pull into the beer store, and I'd go in and get a case of beer or two for the players, put it at the back of the bus. They could have, there they are. Well, can you imagine nowadays? I'd be out the door, right? And so I always appreciated the fact that that never got out. They kind of kept that quiet. And but there was nothing on the lead up to '97 that was like catastrophic or a detrimental thing. The year just built very sequentially. We had a really good spring, or a real good training camp. We had a lot of players who'd been there a few years, and they were committed to winning this thing. We had terrific leaders on the team. There was a lot of stuff I didn't even have to say or do, because guys like, one of the reasons I brought Billy on as a coach was for that. He was still pretty close to the players, and I knew that he could be that bridge that I could use more effectively. And because you can't send Hank into a room of players and tell him to motivate them. It doesn't work that way. And
No.
Bill was good that way because he was so friends with them. So that was a big. In fact, I'd always hoped Bill would take the program over, but I completely understand. We're getting out of and but that year was just we didn't have any injuries. That was big, because in '99 I thought we had as good a team as '97, but arm. It just didn't. So there's a lot of little things like that. People don't realize. I'm sure if you talk to Jeff, there was a couple of seasons where he may have thought they could have won it, but for uncontrollable things like injuries, you just, for somebody academically can't play, things that you can't control. And we were fortunate we didn't have any of them. So it was just a good year all around.
Yeah, that's amazing. Don, what led to, and what was a little bit of the story of getting official OUA status for baseball?
Well, I had a bit of an ongoing feud with Bill Martin, kind of behind the scenes, about he had fined us during the season for using Rawlings baseballs that we were. Yeah,
Sorry.
he fined us. And I said, I'm not paying $100 fine for that. This is a program that runs on its fingernails as it is, and there's nothing wrong with the balls. They're approved, but they're the same ones that you were talking about. And he said, well, if you don't pay the fine, you're suspended for the rest of the season as a team. Like, that mentality, just because he wants us to use the balls he's making money off, and he's going to cancel our season because we're using a ball that's better than what he's got. And it was just, for me, that was the last straw. And I went to Therese, and I talked to her about the problems, and she said, "Why don't you talk to Ward Dills, who was the chairman of OUA?" So I had a number of meetings with Ward, and we agreed. I put a presentation together that talked about the positive aspects of having baseball as an OUA program, and I presented it at an OUA annual meeting. And then Ward was very supportive, I will admit. I'm sure he and Therese probably lobbied the rest of the board to move in that direction. And unfortunately, they did, and I was able to get that done before I left. And now, I'm not privy to all of the ins and outs of the current baseball seasons, and I don't know. I suspect that the OUA could do a lot better and do a lot more. They could have run this into girls baseball, but they haven't done it. And, a lot of those things. But
Yeah, I think.
it
But
was,
I
yeah, it was something that I really wanted to get done before I left.
well, it really legitimizes the sport, in terms of, it needs also to maybe be. You need vision there to take it to a U Sport status, because they play it in
Exactly.
Quebec and they play it in the West.
Yeah.
And the good program shouldn't be having to go to the NAIA. Like they should be able to play in Canada in division
Sure.
and the rest of it. But that takes, I think, a little bit of leadership that's maybe not there.
Yeah, you need a couple of champions at the decision-making level to move it forward. I don't know. I would guarantee you that if someone went to the OUA, said they wanted a girls' baseball league, it would probably happen in a year. So rather than that happen in isolation, it's too bad they didn't sort of make that part of a plan earlier on. Develop men's baseball more, pilot in some girls' baseball and/or fastball. Like they kind of let girls' fastball just swing on the vine too. It's too bad, quite frankly.
Yeah, because I think you need a plan that says, okay, we're going to isolate schools like Brock, like McMaster, that are close to the U.S. border.
Yep.
And look at facilities on campus, which in Brock's case is a no-doubter, no-brainer. They have all the space in the world there to do it.
That's right.
And could have done it as part of this last Canada Games hosting. Never mind multiple times before that. But then, you have to build a recruiting plan around it. You have to understand the value of international students. We brought an American over that played in Canada, paid Canadian tuition to be a member of Brock, and like those kinds of things. If you think about it over 30-year legacies and the average cost of tuition over 30 years, these programs have been responsible for millions of dollars in spent years.
100%. Yeah.
And they have not. They've put back dimes comparative to. Not even pennies, probably comparative.
And with a former great player like Andrew Tinish working for the Jays, to me that's the perfect opportunity to a portal to have some serious discussions around a more expanded support role by Major League Baseball through Canadian universities. There's a lot. I mean, there's a hell of a lot of Canadian players in MLB now, and when Canada plays in the World Baseball Championships, you get all the coverage in the world on TSN and that, but once it's over, they never even think to cover, Canadian baseball university championships. I mean, it's. I mean, hell, they don't even cover U Sport hockey now worth a damn. I mean, it's very embarrassing, quite frankly, very embarrassing.
Yeah, and I think there's an appetite for change for sure. I just don't. I don't have a magic crystal ball, even though I could rub my head, I suspect, a few times. But I don't really have a crystal ball as to how that changes. I do know that it should start with the programs that originated the movement, right? So if you think about it, it's McGill, it's Guelph, it's Brock, it's Mac, it's U of T. It's those originating programs that are still around in some form or fashion that have a legacy of producing extraordinary lives. So to my point about doing this, the greatest championship ring for all involved is living a good life after you've spent time on a varsity
Absolutely.
team. And I think one thing that I've noticed is you have an extraordinary number of great character people in that McMaster program. And tell me a little bit about what it was like reuniting with them in 2018 when you guys got inducted into the McMaster Hall of Fame. Just what it was like catching up with some of these people, and what was the sense of pride in seeing how they had developed as adults?
Well, that aside from realizing I was a lot older than I was, seeing those players today and what they've become is, to me personally, a far greater win than any national championship. Adam Dusky, I don't know if you remember Adam, but he came out of the London area. He was just a great guy, role player, first base, little pitching. His dad passed away during, I think, his second year at Mac, and yeah, that was a real tough thing for him, like anyone would be to experience. But it was, we did some little things, like we put his dad's initials on the side of our warm-up jerseys. We recognized the loss that he felt, and he in 2018 reminded me of that. And those are, and he flew back he's in Connecticut now. He flew back with his two little girls and his wife, and he's doing remarkably well with a large firm down there. Gibby is a teacher. Hughesy, Pino, doing what they're, be in the medical field profession. Doug Lunny I think he's a vice president with a pharmaceutical company now. His son's at Brock, and so not this past summer, the one before, Doug was coaching a Newmarket team that was in the Canadian Championships in Dartmouth here, and Reed was playing for them. So I went to see them. We had lunch. I still text Reed every once in a while. Dougie's daughter is in the Canadian national women's hockey team. She's at Nipissing. She's up the top of the league in scoring. So many of these players are teachers. They're making a significant contribution to society. And that is what it's all about. That's when I talk earlier about the character and developing character of the player, that's what goes with them. Their baseball skills will go down. Their character skills will go up. And then they become better human beings. And God knows we need more better human beings. So anything that I've been able to do, I'll tell you, in 1975, the Pee Wee team that I coached that won the Ontario's, I still get phone calls, emails, and texts from those guys. Last summer, I was back in Hamilton. We had a big get-together with those guys. So they're all about 10 years older than the fellas, than your group of guys. But, that's what amazes me. That's when you've had an impact in a positive way, when somebody drops you a line, sends you a picture of their kids, those kinds of things. And the fact that so many of them are involved in coaching various sports, what more can you ask for, right?
Yeah, it's been pretty unbelievable. I just, it feels like a running joke now. And when I ask it, like, what are you up to? Oh, I'm coaching.
Yeah.
Jeez, good for you. It's great that they have got that ability to give back. We all give back in different ways, but
yeah.
I'm going to ask you kind of a funny question, because it's something only a baseball manager could Do you remember the first time you got thrown out of a game?
Oh, first time I got thrown out of a game. Jesus. That would have been back in the early 70s when I started coaching. I've, uh,
Do you
I've,
remember what it was about? Or was it just,
yeah, it was about balls and strikes, which I knew wasn't going to go very far, but the guy was so bad behind the plate. I was trying to wake him up, so, um, but I've had a few tosses in my time. A lot of times it was trying because I knew a player was going to go off, so I didn't want to particularly lose the player, and better if anybody's going to get. And I knew Martin would suspend me because that was his thing. He loved suspending me and for any chance he got, so he would do it. And I remember going toe to toe with him when he was umpire and up in Waterloo, just right in his grill. Like I said, you got no business being on this field. You do. I thought I was fairly eloquent. I called him a duplicitous bastard. So, but he and I don't know if he got it right away, but nevertheless, yes, a lot of times it's about it's any manager will tell you a lot of times arguing with an ump is to set something up for later on. And if you see a pattern of what you think are bad calls, you've got to call it out because what'll happen, and you've been there, players will get frustrated. They'll start, yapping off, and then the whole thing unravels, right? So better that you go on your own and let them all go, attaboy, Skip, and then focus on the game again. So, it
yeah,
is
it
what it
is.
is.
It is one thing I do know of every great manager I've played for is that they become the lightning rod, or at least just like they're going to go and take one because they know that the umpiring has just reached a point where it's distracting from the focus of the players.
Yeah.
And it's interesting from that perspective to hear it. It's kind of funny. I think everyone remembers that one big meltdown that they had, or that
Yeah.
great line that they cracked out, or the first time, in your case.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's good that you had a running feud with Bill Martin. I couldn't think of a better person to have a feud with.
Yeah. No, I know.
So look, like Don, you've clearly had a pretty distinguished career there, and so tell me a little bit about how you wind up your Mac career and just the decisions that lead you to where you are today, and a little bit more insight into what life is like in the East Coast of Canada.
Yeah, you know what? Like I said earlier, when in getting the opportunity to coach the team at the World Championships that was a big deal for me, quite frankly, personally. And I think Jeff had an opportunity to do that too, if I'm not mistaken, a few years later. But and hopefully the financial aspect of it was better by then. But one of the things that when we got to Italy, our equipment didn't get there with us. And so we had to borrow equipment off another team. Like, oh my God, it was something else. But, and I always remember on that trip, Pino went, and he was studying for his medical exams. So we're in this hotel, and at the bottom of the stairwell, you know how a stairwell will go down, it just dead ends, and there's a sort of, you can sit under the stair. He would go down there and sit and read his medical books. He'd have his medical books on the bench. When he wasn't playing, he'd be
Pretty
really
dedicated.
studying, right? Like just classic Pino stuff, right? But I think part of me ran out of gas. I really felt that I needed my kids then had just come down to university, and I wanted to go and see my daughter play basketball. I wanted to spend time with them where I could. And I couldn't do both. So I had that. I had my business that I had started. So you know what? You got to make a decision, right? And there's lots of people that could coach baseball only I could look after my kids and run my business. So um, it was just time, Mike. A lot of things, a lot of reasons. I think anybody that walks away, there's always a certain reluctance and there's that pain of separation, but you know what? You just have to break the cord and go and look forward. I moving down here was a big advantage for me because not only did I get out of baseball, I got out of town, so to speak, and everything was new. New house, new community, new people to meet. So it was a fairly easy transition in that regard. Um, but I do find myself often thinking back. Um, when I'm sitting on the balcony with a beer and a cigar, I often think about looking back on all the people, all the players, the families, all of those sorts of things, the rivalries. I loved the rivalry. I never The Brock Mac rivalry made baseball better. There's no doubt about it. And all of the players and coaches should be congratulated because it was such an important and needed thing for university baseball to have. So
Yeah, I joke a bit. We couldn't get much into our rivalry with poor George Brown, who had
yeah,
the professor playing first base, and
yeah,
it
yeah,
was, but I think it elevated and set a standard. I think that defined a lot of the programs that came. There was better baseball to come from Western Ontario. Finally, UWO Lumley got them going pretty good.
yeah. Lumley did a great job. He's a great coach, and he turned that program around. They were very competitive in the last few years that I was there. And I think now, from what I hear, I don't know, you'd know better than I do, but I heard Laurier it has a pretty good program. So,
Yeah, there was a longtime coach there that I played with named Scott Valentine. Who,
oh, I remember Scott.
yeah, good
Yeah.
guy, smart.
Did, didn't he pitch at Guelph?
I don't know whether he pitched at Guelph, but I thought he pitched at
Hmm.
Laurier and then became the
Okay.
coach. But Scott and I played summer ball together, and he was great. He was a great
Yeah.
coach. He was a player coach, and
Yeah.
between the two of us, a couple of old guys that would go out and keep the 21-year-olds in our team in check, and we, pitch games, and
Yeah.
just a good, smart, dedicated head that, and I feel that, I think part of it was we were riding the wave of the 92-93 Blue Jays that,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
so enrollment was up across the country for baseball, and we're in a bit of a lull right now. So hopefully the Jays can, cash in on all of that potential and reinvigorate the interest in the sport. Because I think that that's part of it. You need a bit of all rows to be, or all the oars to be going in the same direction. But
I
I
agree.
really,
Yeah.
I really think that also re-looking back on 30 years and getting the schools that are involved to say, not only look at what we've accomplished, but look how much there's still left on the table here. Facilities on campus, the ability to recruit in Americans. If you do it right, you can recruit in people from Mexico
Yep.
or, other Dominican where they play a lot of baseball.
Didn't you
They
have
haven't really thought about that.
didn't Brock have a kid from an outfielder who was from Mexico or something back?
They've had several of this
Yeah.
scenario. I mean, I think the next big one to chase down, obviously, is someone from the Pan Pacific,
Yeah. Yeah.
coming and playing ball and going to school here. And, I think that's the next thing. But I think we accomplished that with a small step, like getting everyone together for 30 years and watching 50-year-old men try to break 50 miles an hour while throwing a pitch in.
That's
From that
right.
perspective. But
Yeah.
just a couple of other quick things, because What advice would you give to a person that's just starting their coaching career?
Yeah, I think the key thing is for me, is to learn and understand the importance of character, individual and collective character, in the success of a team, because it's that character that's going to um, allow them to develop hard work. There is nothing that will make your team better than just hard practices. And I mean, I've been out to some local watch practice, kids are fooling around, talking, nobody's paying attention. You can't have it that way. You've got to build that desire to win, and that desire to win and work hard is only going to come with character. And that character is hard to find nowadays. The school systems nowadays, they don't teach responsibility. It's a wild west in the schools. I mean, uh, and there's far too many parents involved in coaching their kids at every level. You got to walk. I mean, it's okay at first or for a while, but at some point you got to let someone else coach your kid. That helps them develop a different view of how they're supposed to act and work, and so that character is huge. You give me a team with a little less talent but a lot of character, and I'll win you a championship. And it's been proven over and over again.
Well, I think the other piece of advice we'll have to give is if someone's mom is calling on behalf of an 18-year-old player,
Okay.
modern technology should allow you to not take that call, my friend.
Yeah.
I can't believe
Yeah.
you had to do that.
Exactly. That was a real eye opener.
It's a good thing I was in pitching then, because all you would have had to do was slide me the number, and it would have been right in the between the numbers.
Yeah, and then he could have just screamed at his mom up in the stands. So.
Yeah, well, he won't be playing anymore because that'll last for about 6 weeks.
Yeah, for sure.
Don, you got anything that you want to get accomplished? Like, is there a place you'd like to travel to in the next little while? I mean, other than coming out and making Billy, and that might be Hank's job to make Bill run down the line if there's a wild throw at first.
A little thumper.
No, there's some things you want to get done personally in the next little while that are important to you?
Well, I'm in the middle of merging. I have a small consulting business that I've been, and I focus on leadership training in organizations, primarily municipal governments and that sort of thing. And we do that along with certain types of HR training. And we're going to merge with a company out of Moncton, New Brunswick. So, I mean, a lot of people say, well, why the hell are you doing that at this stage of your life? And it's basically because I just like to stay busy. I don't want to sit around and watch TV or that. I like to stay busy. I like to build things, and that's one of the things I'm trying to build. We are doing some more traveling. We went to Scotland a couple of years ago, and we're going to go again this September. It's kind of one of those long story, but essentially found out about when my mother passed a few years back. Her birth mother died shortly after she was born. We never knew the whole story, so there's a whole family on that side. And I've kind of tracked down where in Scotland they were from, and I just want to go back there and sit in a local pub and have a couple of beers and that sort of thing. So it's nothing earth shattering. It's all just personal stuff that I want to get done. And my wife and I enjoy traveling together, so we'll do that. And then you know what? It's just hoping I can stick around long enough to see my grandkids get a little bit bigger. So.
Well, you have to start. I hate to say this. I'm going to have to. This will be the next big event that I get involved with. You need to start training for a cage match with Bill Martin. It'll be great.
Well, Mike, I go to the gym 4 days a week. I don't think Bill does, and it wouldn't have been much. It would not have been much of a battle back then, and I don't think it'd be much right now. So.
I think you may have caught one of my last conversations with the gentleman. I may have called him the Doughboy by because I was it was similar. It's ironic, I will say this is an irony, and I can say it on a podcast because it's the absolute truth. We had a net binding national agreement with Rawlings, and they refused to use it in the East schools because Bill was selling them all-star baseballs, and we didn't find them because we were just trying to find a solution. So out of that came the first games in the Sky Dome. That solution was, okay, we're going to use these baseballs that they're not using in the East Coast to do Brock versus Durham College and Mac versus U of T in the Dome.
Right.
And so, that's the difference, other than finding the people that are your support base, we went and tried to come up with a positive outcome involving the Jays. So,
well, that's it. And if you look at what happened to baseball on the East Coast, it didn't survive. It's not there. It hasn't. If it is, it certainly hasn't grown. And so, if you tend to do things for yourself instead of for the greater good, they don't always turn out too well.
No, and I think we've got lots to be proud of. Our programs are still, finding their footing today, but they both exist. They have long legacies of graduates and people that are making great differences in the community. And, the McMaster team and culture really benefited from having such great leadership, Don. I really appreciate you spending some time with us today. And if you're not hanging around eating haggis and in a kilt in September.
That's right. Well, if I come, maybe I'll just wear my kilt. That'd make for a good photo op.
Be better than those blue uniforms the Mac guys had to wear.
Right.
I'm surprised they didn't have to wear a kilt.
Yeah, that's right.
Listen, thank you so much for today. It was great catching up, and I'm sure the players are going to love to hear what you've been up to, and we'll keep trucking.
Yeah, well, thanks very much, Mike, and all the best to all the players from both teams. It's all
Well, the smell